The return to Willow Creek. Madison Clark tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her car rumbled over the uneven gravel road that led to her childhood home. The sprawling pines of the Rockies loomed above, their jagged silhouettes slicing into the twilight sky. The house was just as she remembered, weathered gray with its chipped blue shutters, standing stoically at the edge of Willow Creek like a sentinel of forgotten memories. It had been 10 years since she'd left this town, swearing never to return. But now, the emptiness of her brother Connor's absence pulled her back. She parked the car, shutting off the engine, and let the silence envelop her. "This place still feels the same," she murmured, stepping out and inhaling the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. A shiver ran down her spine, though the air was warm. Madison hadn't just come home to grieve. She'd come seeking answers. Connor's sudden death in a hiking accident had left a gaping hole in her heart and a flood of unanswered questions. Her brother, the fearless dreamer, had always been drawn to the wild, the whispering woods of Willow Creek, his playground. The house felt like a time capsule. Dust motes floated lazily in the fading sunlight streaming through the windows. Madison moved slowly through the living room, running her fingers over the worn armchair where Connor used to sit with his sketchpad. On the coffee table sat a photo of them as kids, their faces smeared with chocolate, grinning ear to ear. She picked it up, tracing her brother's face. "Why did you have to leave so soon?" she whispered, her voice catching. Determined to find something, anything, that might explain what had drawn him to the woods that final day, Madison climbed the stairs to his room. It was almost untouched, as if he just stepped out for a moment. His desk was cluttered with pencils, crumpled papers, and a sketch pad lying slightly ajar. Curiosity gnawed at her as she flipped through the pages. Connor's sketches had always been vibrant and full of life, capturing the essence of Willow Creek. But as she turned the pages, a chill crept over her. The later sketches weren't of trees or rivers, they were of a shadowy figure. It loomed tall, its edges undefined, with two glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the page. Each drawing was more detailed than the last, as if Connor had been fixated on it. Below one of the sketches, in Connor's scrawled handwriting, were the words, "The Whispering Shadow." Madison's breath caught. The name tugged at something buried deep in her memory, a story Connor had told her when they were children. "There's someone watching over us in the woods," he had whispered one night, his voice tinged with excitement and fear. "Not a person, but something else, something that protects us." Back then, she'd laughed it off as another one of his wild tales. But now, staring at the vivid sketches, she wasn't so sure. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Madison lay in the old creaky bed of her childhood room, the whispers of the forest seeping through the cracked window. It was faint at first, a rustling, like leaves shifting in a breeze. But then it grew, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through her chest. Her heart pounded as she sat up, straining to hear. For a moment, it was silent, and she thought she'd imagined it. Then, faintly, came a sound, a whisper. "Madison?" The sound was so soft, so fleeting, she almost doubted it was real. But it sent a chill racing down her spine. She hurried to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest stood still, its shadows impenetrable. Just the wind, she told herself, closing the window firmly. But the unease lingered. The next morning, as she stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, something caught her eye. A single black feather lay on the wooden step. It was long and sleek, unlike any bird she'd ever seen near Willow Creek. She picked it up, running her fingers over its smooth surface. A sense of foreboding settled over her, and the memory of Connor's drawings flashed in her mind. "Is this what you meant, Connor?" she muttered. "Did you see something out there?" Her gaze drifted toward the forest, its dense canopy hiding secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. But something told her that the answers to her brother's death and the whispers that haunted this place lay within. End of Part 1. Part 2. Signs in the Shadows. Madison couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching her. The black feather sat on the kitchen counter, its presence unnerving yet impossible to ignore. She had tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but something about it, combined with Connor's sketches, gnawed at her. After a quick breakfast, she grabbed her jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, grounding her momentarily. She looked toward the woods, their shadows long and inviting in the early light. Madison hesitated. The rational part of her screamed that she should let it go, leave the past where it belonged. But her heart whispered a different truth. If Connor had believed in this whispering shadow, then she owed it to him to find out why. A visit to Jack. The first place she went was Jack's cabin. Nestled just a mile from the edge of the woods, his place was a ramshackle but cozy home, built from thick logs and surrounded by stacks of firewood. Jack had been Connor's best friend since they were kids, and if anyone knew what had drawn Connor into the forest that fateful day, it was him. Madison, Jack said, surprised to see her when he opened the door. His scruffy beard and weathered face gave him the look of someone who belonged in the wilderness. It's been a long time. Too long, Madison admitted, stepping inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. I need to ask you something about Connor. Jack's expression softened, and he nodded. I figured you might. He gestured for her to sit down. As she explained the sketches and the feather, Jack listened intently, his face betraying little emotion. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. I don't know much about what Connor saw, Jack began, choosing his words carefully. But I know he believed it. He told me about that shadow. Said it had been following him for years, even when we were kids. I thought it was just his imagination back then. But you don't think that anymore? Madison pressed. Jack shook his head. I don't know what to believe. There were pop moments that didn't make sense. Times when we'd be out hunting, and Connor would say we needed to leave, like he knew something was coming. And then a storm would roll in, or we'd hear wolves howling close by. It was like he could sense things before they happened. Madison felt a chill run through her. Did he ever tell you what it was? This shadow? Jack hesitated. Not really. He just said it wasn't human, and that it wasn't here to hurt him, but to watch over him. The words struck a nerve. The sketches, the whispers, the feather, it was all adding up to something Madison couldn't explain. Martha's warning. Leaving Jack's cabin, Madison decided to visit Martha, the town's oldest resident. The eccentric widow was known for her knowledge of Willow Creek's lore and legends. Martha's house was a riot of color, with hanging flower baskets and wind chimes tinkling in the breeze. The old woman greeted Madison with a knowing smile. Come in, dear, she said, her voice warm but firm. I was wondering when you'd come by. Madison blinked in surprise. You were expecting me? Martha chuckled, her eyes twinkling. Oh, I've been hearing whispers, too. The forest is restless. It always gets like this when someone's looking for answers. Sitting across from Martha in her cluttered living room, Madison explained everything. Connor's drawings, the feather, the whispers in the night. Martha listened, nodding occasionally, her expression thoughtful. When Madison finished, Martha leaned forward. The whispering shadow isn't just some bedtime story, my dear. It's as old as the mountains themselves. The people who lived here before us, long before us, they called it Cosenna. What does it mean? Madison asked, leaning in. Roughly translated, the silent watcher. They believed it was a guardian spirit tied to the land. It protected those who respected the forest and punished those who didn't. Martha's voice lowered. But the thing about guardians is, they don't act without reason. If your brother was tied to it, then it wasn't by accident. Madison's stomach tightened. What are you saying? Martha shrugged. Whatever Connor was looking for out there, he found it. And it's not done with you yet. The second feather. That evening, Madison sat on the porch, staring at the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. The shadows grew longer, stretching out like fingers across the land. She thought about what Jack and Martha had said, their words swirling in her mind like leaves caught in a gust of wind. As the first stars blinked into view, she felt the weight of something shift near her feet. Looking down, her breath caught. Another feather, black as midnight, lying neatly on the porch step beside the first. Her heart raced. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Madison picked up the new feather, holding it against the fading light. It was identical to the first, smooth, perfect, and unnaturally pristine. You're trying to tell me something, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the breeze. The forest didn't answer, but the shadows seemed to stir, as if acknowledging her words. Madison's grip on the feather tightened. Whatever was out there, it had been watching her, and Connor, for a long time. She didn't know if it was a protector, a predator, or something in between. But one thing was clear, it wasn't going to let her ignore it. Part 3. Whispers in the Dark. The two feathers sat side by side on Madison's desk, their black sheen catching the faint light of the lamp. She couldn't stop staring at them. They seemed ordinary, yet their appearance, first one and then the other, was anything but. The unease coiling in her chest was growing harder to ignore. Her mind kept drifting back to Martha's words. Whatever Connor was looking for out there, he found it, and it's not done with you yet. Madison clenched her fists, pushing back the rising tide of doubt and fear. If you're trying to tell me something, I'll figure it out, she whispered into the empty room. A walk into the forest. The next morning, Madison decided she couldn't stay on the edges anymore. If answers lay in the forest, she would have to find them herself. Armed with a flashlight, her phone, and a notebook, she ventured into the trees. The air inside the forest felt different, heavier, almost alive. The towering pines swayed gently in the breeze, their needles whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. The ground was soft beneath her boots, damp with morning dew, and the shadows stretched long in the filtered sunlight. Madison followed the same trail she and Connor had taken as kids, winding through the underbrush until she reached a clearing. It was a place she hadn't seen in years, but remembered vividly. The clearing was small, with a smooth boulder in the center and a circle of wildflowers growing in defiance of the forest's darkness. Connor had always called it their secret place. As she stood there, something caught her eye. Lying atop the boulder was another black feather. Her heart skipped a beat. She approached slowly, picking it up and running her fingers over its surface. Like the others, it was perfect, pristine, and felt oddly warm to the touch. A faint rustling made her freeze. She turned sharply, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The forest was silent. Not even the chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves broke the stillness. Madison's pulse quickened, her every nerve on edge. She took a step back, clutching the feather tightly, and that's when she saw it. In the shadows between two pines, a figure stood. The first glimpse, it was tall, too tall to be human. Its form was shrouded in darkness, blending seamlessly with the shadows around it. Two golden eyes glowed faintly, fixed on her. Madison's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The figure didn't advance or retreat. It simply watched, silent and unyielding. "Are you the whispering shadow?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, without a sound, it melted back into the darkness, leaving Madison standing alone in the clearing. For a long moment, she couldn't move, her mind racing with what she had just seen. Whatever it wasn't human. But it also hadn't felt malevolent. If anything, it had seemed curious. Discovering Connor's map. Shaken but determined, Madison returned to the house. Her encounter with the figure had only deepened her need for answers. She knew Connor must have left something, some clue about what he had found in the forest. She searched his room again, this time more thoroughly. Pulling open drawers, flipping through books, rifling through papers, she finally found it. A folded piece of parchment tucked inside the back cover of one of his sketch pads. Unfolding it, she saw a hand-drawn map of the forest. Several areas were marked with X's, and in the corner, Connor had scrawled a note. "They're watching, but why?" Madison traced the path on the map with her finger. One of the X's was near the clearing she had just visited. Another was deeper into the woods, near a rocky outcrop she vaguely remembered from her childhood. She felt a strange mix of fear and determination. Connor had been trying to understand the same thing she was now. Whatever had drawn him deeper into the forest was still there, and it was watching her too. A warning from Jack that evening. Madison paid another visit to Jack, bringing the map with her. "Jack," she said, unfolding it on his kitchen table. "Do you know anything about these places?" Jack studied the map, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, I know them," he said slowly. "This one here." He pointed to the X near the rocky outcrop. "That's where Connor died." Madison's stomach lurched. "And the others?" Jack hesitated, his eyes darkening. "Places people don't go. Strange things happen out there. Missing hikers, weird noises at night. Folks around here have always avoided them. Madison swallowed hard, her resolve wavering. But Connor didn't. Jack looked at her, his expression grim. Connor wasn't scared of the forest. He said it was trying to tell him something, like it wanted him to understand. But Maddie, whatever he found out there, it cost him his life. I have to know, Madison said firmly, though her voice trembled. I can't walk away from this. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. If you're dead set on this, take my radio, and don't go out there alone after dark. The second encounter. That night, Madison sat at her desk, studying the map. She felt the weight of the feathers beside her, their presence both comforting and ominous. As the clock ticked past midnight, the whispers began again, faint, like the rustle of leaves, but unmistakable. She looked up, her breath hitching. The window above her desk was open, and beyond it, the forest loomed. The golden eyes appeared again, just beyond the tree line. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. Madison felt a strange calm wash over her. Gathering the feathers, she walked to the window and placed them on the sill. If you want me to follow, give me a sign, she whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft breeze swept through the room, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something ancient. The golden eyes blinked once, then vanished into the night. End of part 3. Phần tiếp theo sẽ đưa Madison vào sâu hơn trong rừng khi cô bắt đầu khám phá các địa điểm trên bản đồ và đối mặt với những sự thật kinh hoàng về The Whispering Shadow. Part 4, Into the Heart of the Forest. Morning light streamed through the thin curtains, but Madison hadn't slept. The map lay spread across the desk, its faded lines and scrawled notes now etched into her memory. She'd spent the night preparing, packing a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, a water bottle, the radio Jack had given her, and the notebook where she was meticulously documenting everything. Her eyes kept drifting to the map, her gaze fixed on the X near the rocky outcrop where Connor had died. That was her next destination.
The journey begins.
The forest was quiet as Madison stepped onto the trail, her boots crunching softly on the pine needle-covered path. The cool morning air was heavy with moisture, and the sunlight struggled to pierce through the dense canopy overhead. With the map clutched in one hand and her phone's compass app in the other, Madison navigated deeper into the woods. The familiar trails of her childhood gave way to overgrown paths, the underbrush growing thicker with each step. The silence became oppressive. No birds chirped, no rustle of small animals disturbed the stillness. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. As she approached the first marked location on the map, a grove of twisted trees, her nerves were taut. The trees here seemed older, their gnarled branches reaching toward each other like skeletal fingers. Madison stopped in the center of the grove, scanning her surroundings. At first, there was nothing unusual. Then she noticed the carvings. Etched into the bark of the largest tree were strange symbols, spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like a crude depiction of an eye. They were weathered and faint, but unmistakably deliberate. She traced a finger over one of the carvings, her skin tingling as though the symbols radiated energy. Her notebook was out in an instant, and she carefully sketched the markings, her mind racing with questions. The first sign. As Madison finished her sketch, a soft rustling sound made her freeze. It was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. The beam landed on a single black feather, lying perfectly in the center of the path she had just walked. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't seen it there before. It was as though it had been placed deliberately. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I get it. I'll keep going." She picked up the feather, slipping it into her bag alongside the others, and continued toward the rocky outcrop. The rocky outcrop. The trail grew steeper, the ground uneven and dotted with roots that threatened to trip her. Madison's breathing grew heavier as she climbed, but she pressed on, driven by the thought of Connor and the need to understand what had happened to him. When she finally reached the outcrop, she stopped to catch her breath. The view was stunning, the forest stretching out below her in a sea of green, with the distant peaks of the Rockies rising against the clear blue sky. But it wasn't the view that held her attention. It was the clearing below the outcrop, the spot where Connor had died. The The area was eerily undisturbed, as though time had frozen there. She could see the faint outline of where his body had been found, the grass still bent and discolored. Madison felt a lump rise in her as she carefully descended the rocky slope. Her boots crunched softly as she stepped into the clearing, her eyes scanning every inch of the ground. The discovery. At first, Madison saw nothing out of the ordinary. The clearing was quiet, the air heavy and still. But then she noticed something glinting in the grass. Kneeling down, she brushed aside the foliage and uncovered a small object, a pendant. It was simple, made of tarnished silver, with an engraved spiral similar to the symbols she had seen in the grove. Madison's chest tightened. She remembered seeing this pendant in one of Connor's sketches. He had drawn it over and over, always accompanied by the figure of the whispering shadow. As she held the pendant in her hand, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, chilling her to the bone. The trees around her swayed violently, their branches creaking like old doors. And then she heard it. A whisper. "Madison?" Her blood ran cold. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but unmistakably real. She turned in every direction, searching for the source, but the clearing was empty. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "You shouldn't have come?" Madison's heart pounded as the wind died down, leaving the forest eerily silent once more. A warning left behind. Shaken, Madison pocketed the pendant and quickly began her descent from the outcrop. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows longer and more menacing. As she retraced her steps, she realized the trail had changed. The familiar path was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and unfamiliar trees. Panic set in as she tried to get her bearings, checking her phone's compass. But the compass spun wildly, refusing to settle on a direction. "Great," she muttered, gripping the map tightly. "Just great." Then she saw it. Another black feather, lying in the middle of the path ahead. Madison hesitated. The feathers had always appeared to guide her, but now she wasn't so sure. Was this a sign of the shadow's protection, or a warning to stay away? Steeling herself, she picked up the feather and continued forward, hoping it would lead her back to safety. The cabin in the woods. After what felt like hours of wandering, Madison stumbled upon something unexpected. A small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. The structure was ancient, its wooden beams warped and moss-covered. The windows were shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Madison hesitated at the threshold, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But something compelled her to enter. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decay and earth. The floor was littered with debris, fallen branches, leaves, and animal bones. But what drew her attention was the table in the center of the room. On it lay another feather, this one larger than any she had found before. Next to it was a piece of parchment, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. Madison picked up the parchment, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. Scrawled across the page in bold, jagged letters were the words, "Leave while you can." Part 5, The Silent Watcher. Madison's hands trembled as she folded the parchment and placed it in her bag. The warning was clear, yet she couldn't leave, not now. Every step deeper into the forest had only drawn her closer to understanding what had consumed Connor's final days. The large feather on the table caught her attention again. It was different from the others, longer, thicker, and with a faint shimmer that seemed to glow in the dim light filtering through the cabin's broken windows. As she reached out to touch it, a low creaking sound echoed from deeper within the cabin. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. No response. The cabin fell silent once more, but the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. Madison shone her flashlight into the darkened corners, illuminating cobwebs, splintered wood, and old, decaying furniture. The creaking came again, this time closer. She gripped the flashlight tighter, swinging its beam toward the source of the noise. A faint shadow darted across the far wall, too quick to make out. Madison's breath hitched as she backed toward the door, her every instinct screaming at her to run. But just as she reached the threshold, a voice whispered from the shadows, "Don't go." The figure in the dark? Madison whipped around, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The voice wasn't her imagination this time. It was real, soft, melodic and undeniably human. The beam of light landed on a figure standing in the far corner of the cabin. It was cloaked in darkness, but its golden eyes gleamed, cutting through the shadows like twin embers. "You've been following me," Madison said, her voice wavering. "Why?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only stared. Taking a shaky step forward, Madison held up the pendant she had found near the outcrop. "Do you know what this is?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. Slowly, it raised an arm, long and unnaturally thin, and pointed toward the feather on the table. Madison hesitated before picking it up. The moment her fingers closed around the quill, a rush of sensations flooded her mind, images, sounds, and emotions that weren't her own. She saw Connor standing in the same cabin, holding the same feather. His face was etched with determination and fear as he spoke to the shadowy figure. "Tell me what you want from me," Connor had said. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Madison gasping for breath. The figure lowered its arm, stepping back into the shadows. "What did you show him?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What did you want from my brother?" The whisper returned, soft but chilling. "The truth. The chase begins." Before Madison could ask another question, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. "No, wait," she called, rushing out of the cabin. The forest was alive now, the once silent trees whispering and swaying as though caught in a storm. Madison caught a glimpse of the figure's golden eyes darting between the trunks, guiding her deeper into the woods. She followed, the map in her bag forgotten as she pushed through the underbrush. Branches clawed at her jacket, and the uneven ground threatened to trip her with every step. But she didn't stop. The figure moved with an almost inhuman grace, always just out of reach. Madison's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled into another clearing, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Here, the air was different, warmer, heavier, and filled with a faint hum that resonated in her chest. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its massive trunk twisted and blackened as though it had been struck by lightning. The figure stood before it, motionless. Madison approached cautiously, her gaze flicking between the figure and the tree. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer, but its golden eyes shifted toward the base of the tree. Madison followed its gaze and saw something that made her blood run cold. A small pile of belongings lay there, items she recognized immediately. Connor's backpack, his sketch pad, and his hiking boots, still caked with dried mud. The revelation. Madison dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she picked up the sketch pad. Flipping through the pages, she found more drawings of the whispering shadow, detailed and haunting, each one more vivid than the last. On the final page, Connor had scrawled a message. "The truth lies here. I couldn't face it, but maybe you can." Tears blurred Madison's vision as she clutched the sketch pad to her chest. "Connor," she whispered, "what happened to you?" The figure stepped closer, its presence almost tangible now. Madison looked up, meeting its glowing eyes. "Did you take him?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Did you hurt him?" The figure shook its head slowly, then pointed to the base of the tree. Madison hesitated before reaching out to touch the gnarled roots. The moment her fingers brushed the bark, another vision overtook her. She saw Connor again, standing in the clearing, his face pale but resolute. The whispering shadow loomed before him, its form more defined now, tall and otherworldly, with limbs that seemed to stretch and shift like smoke. Connor held the pendant in one hand, his other hand resting on the tree. "If this is what you want," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, "then take it." The vision faded, leaving Madison reeling. "What did he give you?" she demanded, her voice raw. The figure's golden eyes dimmed, its form seeming to shrink. The whisper returned, soft and mournful. "His hope. The unseen cost." Madison staggered back, her mind racing. Connor had believed this thing wanted to protect him, but at what cost? What had it taken from him that led to his death? The figure turned away, its form dissolving into the shadows once more. Madison called after it, but it didn't return. She sank to the ground, clutching Connor's sketchpad and pendant. The weight of the truth, or the lack of it, pressed heavily on her chest. The forest fell silent again, but Madison knew it wasn't over. The whispering shadow had given her a glimpse of what had happened to Connor, but it hadn't told her everything. It was up to her to find the rest of the truth and to decide whether facing it was worth the price Connor had paid. Part 6. The Cost of Truth. Madison sat in the clearing long after the whispering shadow had vanished. Connor's belongings lay before her like fragments of a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. The pendant felt heavy around her neck, its spiraled engraving pressing into her skin. The forest was silent now, but the silence didn't comfort her. It weighed on her like an unanswered question, as though the very trees were waiting for her next move. She looked at Connor's sketchpad again, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Each drawing of the shadow seemed to pulse with life, the golden eyes watching her even from the paper. On the last page, next to Connor's scrawled words, "The truth lies here," was a symbol she hadn't noticed before. It was a spiral, almost identical to the one on the pendant, but it was surrounded by jagged lines that radiated outward like cracks. Beneath it, Connor had written a single word: choice. A return to Martha. By the time Madison returned to Willow Creek, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the town was bathed in the muted glow of twilight. Her body ached from the hike, but her mind was racing with questions. She went straight to Martha's house, not bothering to knock before stepping inside. Martha was in her usual chair by the fireplace, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in Madison's disheveled appearance. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Martha asked, her tone more knowing than surprised. Madison nodded, dropping into the chair opposite her. "I saw it, but I still don't understand. It showed me Connor, and I think it took something from him. He called it hope." Martha set her mug down, the lines on her face deepening. The whispering shadow doesn't just take, it exchanges. It gives protection, insight, even power, but it always demands something in return. And what it takes isn't always what you expect. "Connor trusted it," Madison said, her voice cracking. "He thought it was helping him." Martha sighed. "Connor was always a dreamer, too eager to believe in the good. But that shadow, it's not evil, Madison. It's ancient, and it operates on rules we can't fully understand." To Connor, hope might have seemed like a small price to pay. He likely didn't realize how much of himself was tied to it until it was gone. Madison stared at the pendant around her neck, her chest tightening. "And now it's watching me. I think it wants me to finish what Connor started." "Then you must be very careful," Martha warned, leaning forward. "It will show you truths you've never imagined, but the cost might be more than you're willing to give." A night of visions. That night, Madison couldn't sleep. The pendant seemed to hum faintly against her chest, its spiral almost glowing in the dim light of her room. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, when the whispers began again. They were louder this time, almost insistent, and they seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Come back to us." "The truth waits." The voices merged into a rhythmic chant, pulling at something deep within her. Before she realized what was happening, Madison was on her feet, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand. The forest outside her window seemed to beckon, the shadows shifting and swaying in time with the whispers. Without thinking, she grabbed her flashlight and jacket, heading out into the night. The forest was alive in a way it hadn't been before. The air buzzed with energy, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. The pendant grew warmer against Madison's chest, guiding her steps like an invisible compass. She didn't need the map this time. Her feet seemed to know exactly where to go. After what felt like hours, she emerged into another clearing. This one was different from the others, larger, with a single massive tree in its center. The tree's trunk was covered in spiraled carvings, identical to the one on the pendant, and its roots twisted outward like grasping fingers. At the base of the tree stood the whispering shadow. Its golden eyes glowed brighter than before, and its form seemed more solid now, its edges less shrouded in mist. It didn't move as Madison approached, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the clearing with a weight that made it hard to breathe. "You brought me here," Madison said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Why?" The shadow raised a long, thin arm and pointed to the spiral carvings on the tree. As Madison stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. The carvings seemed to pulse, their spirals shifting and twisting before her eyes. Madison felt a pull, as though the tree itself was drawing her in. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the whispers. The shadow lowered its arm, and the whispers abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost painful. Then, in a voice that was both distant and intimate, the shadow spoke. "Your choice." The choice. Madison's heart raced as the meaning of the words sank in. This was the moment Connor had faced, the moment that had taken his hope and left him empty. "What are you asking me to give?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing a hollow at the base of the tree. Inside was a pool of shimmering liquid, its surface reflecting the golden glow of the shadow's eyes. Madison approached cautiously, peering into the pool. It was like looking into a mirror, but instead of her reflection, she saw flashes of images, memories of Connor, her parents, her childhood. They were vivid and beautiful, but they were also tinged with pain. She realized with a sinking feeling what the shadow wanted. It wasn't asking for an object or a possession, it was asking for a part of her. "What do I get in return?" she asked, her voice breaking. The shadow tilted its head, and the whispers returned, softer this time. "Truth." A decision made, Madison stared at the pool, her mind racing. If she accepted, she might finally understand what had happened to Connor and why the shadow had chosen them. But the cost could be unimaginable. She thought of Connor's sketchpad, his last words scrawled on the page. "The truth lies here." Taking a deep breath, Madison stepped closer to the pool. The pendant around her neck glowed brightly, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "I'll give you what you want." As she reached out toward the pool, the whispers rose again, enveloping her in a cacophony of sound. The last thing she saw was the golden eyes of the shadow watching her, unblinking, as the world faded to black. Part 7. The Truth Revealed. Madison awoke in complete darkness. For a moment, she wasn't sure if her eyes were open or closed. The air around her was thick, pressing against her skin like an invisible weight. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though she were submerged in water. Panic clawed at her throat until a faint glow appeared in the distance, a soft golden light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. As the light grew brighter, the weight around her lessened, and she found herself standing in an unfamiliar place. It wasn't the forest anymore. The ground beneath her feet shimmered like liquid glass, and the sky above was a swirling canvas of deep purples and blues, dotted with pinpricks of light that danced and shifted. "Where am I?" Madison whispered, her voice echoing in the vast expanse. The golden light coalesced into a familiar form. The whispering shadow stood before her, its edges still undefined, but its golden eyes piercing as ever. "This is the in-between," the shadow said, its voice resonating within her mind rather than her ears. "The place where truth is born." Madison swallowed hard, her palms damp with sweat. "You promised me answers. Show me." The shadow stepped aside, revealing a large pool of shimmering liquid. Its surface rippled like water, but reflected no sky above, only endless depths. Madison hesitated, unsure of what she was supposed to do. "Touch it," the shadow instructed. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingertips skimming the surface. The liquid was cool, sending a jolt up her arm, and then the world around her dissolved. She was no longer in the in-between. Instead, she stood in the clearing where Connor had died. But it was different, brighter, livelier, as though the forest itself was thriving. Connor was there, standing at the base of the spiral-carved tree. His face was pale but determined, his eyes locked on the whispering shadow that loomed before him. "Why me?" Connor asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his tone. "You were chosen," the shadow replied. "Your soul is pure. You seek not for yourself, but for others." Connor clenched his fists. "And what happens if I say no?" The shadow tilted its head. "You remain as you are, untouched, unknowing, but you will always wonder. The forest will call to you until you answer." Connor looked down at the pendant in his hand, the same one now hanging around Madison's neck. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward. "I accept," he said. The The moment the words left his mouth, the shadow extended one long, dark arm toward him. Its touch was gentle but firm, resting over Connor's chest. A soft golden light emanated from the point of contact, spreading outward until it enveloped him completely. Madison watched in horror as Connor's expression shifted from determination to despair. His shoulders sagged, his eyes dulling as the golden light faded. When the shadow withdrew, Connor dropped to his knees, clutching the pendant tightly. "What did you take from him?" Madison demanded, her voice breaking as the vision dissolved around her. The cost of hope? She was back in the in-between, her knees hitting the glassy ground with a dull thud. The shadow loomed over her, its golden eyes dimmer now. "I took what he offered," it said simply. "His hope," Madison whispered, the weight of the words sinking in. "You took his ability to believe in anything good, his reason to keep going." The shadow didn't respond, but its silence was answer enough. Madison's fists clenched. "And what about me? What will you take from me?" "You will know when the time comes," the shadow said. "But remember, nothing is taken without purpose. What you give willingly." A vision of the forest's past. Before Madison could respond, the pool rippled again, pulling her into another vision. This time, she saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, untouched by human hands, teeming with life. But something dark loomed on the horizon. Men with axes and fire, carving roads through the trees and tearing the land apart. The whispering shadow appeared, standing between the invaders and the heart of the forest. It was larger then, more imposing, its form solid and fierce. The men hesitated, their torches faltering in the presence of the shadow. But they did not retreat. As the men advanced, the shadow unleashed a wave of golden light that swept through the forest, driving them away. The trees healed, the animals returned, and the forest was safe once more. But the cost was clear. The shadow grew smaller, its form fading as it retreated into the depths of the woods. The vision faded, leaving Madison trembling. "You've been protecting the forest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But at what cost? How many others have you taken from?" "Only those who seek me," the shadow replied. "Only those who choose to give." A choice of her own. Madison stood, her legs shaky but firm. The truth was clearer now, but it didn't make her decision any easier. The shadow had shown her what it was, neither good nor evil, but something ancient and bound by rules she could barely comprehend. "You said I have a choice," she said, meeting its golden gaze. "What happens if I refuse?" The shadow tilted its head. "You leave as you came, unchanged, untouched, but burdened with the questions you carry. And if I accept, you will understand, but you will not leave whole." Madison's chest tightened as she looked at the pool, its surface shimmering with possibilities. She thought of Connor, of the cost he had paid for his answers. "I can't leave this unfinished," she said finally, her voice steady. "I need to know." The shadow stepped closer, its form towering over her. "Then offer what you will, and take what you seek." The price paid. Madison reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the pool. She felt the pendant grow warm against her chest, its spiral design pulsing with light. As her fingers touched the surface, a searing pain shot through her, starting in her chest and spreading outward. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, like something was being pulled from her very soul. Memories flashed before her eyes. Her childhood with Connor, their laughter and shared dreams, the love and hope that had carried her through the darkest times. And then it was gone. The pain faded, leaving Madison gasping for breath. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the ground as tears streamed down her face. The shadow stood over her, its golden eyes glowing faintly. "You have given much," it said, its voice softer now, "but you have gained what you sought." Madison looked up, her vision blurred, but her mind clear. For the first time, she understood. Part 8. The Weight of the Truth. Madison remained on her knees long after the whispering shadow had retreated into the darkness. The pain in her chest had subsided, but an ache lingered, a hollow space where something vital had once been. Her thoughts felt sharper, clearer, as if the fog of uncertainty that had plagued her for so long had lifted. But with this clarity came a heavy burden. The truth she had sought now lay before her, unyielding and inescapable. The forest's bond. As Madison rose to her feet, the shimmering landscape of the in-between began to dissolve. Colors bled into shadows, and the ground beneath her feet shifted, solidifying back into the familiar soil of the forest clearing. The spiral carved tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches twisting toward the sky. At its base, Connor's belongings remained untouched. She knelt beside them, her fingers brushing over the sketch pad, the pendant still warm against her chest. The whispers returned, soft and faint, blending with the rustling of the leaves. But this time, they carried a sense of finality. The forest is tied to it, Madison whispered to herself, to the shadow. The visions had shown her everything. The forest's ancient protector, the sacrifices made to keep it alive, and the fragile balance that tethered them together. The whispering shadow wasn't just a guardian. It was the heart of the forest itself, feeding off the emotions and offerings of those who sought its power. But at what cost? Madison's mind replayed Connor's final moments, the light draining from his eyes as he gave up his hope. Her chest tightened. It didn't save him, she muttered, her voice trembling. It just took him. The pendant seemed to pulse against her chest in response, as though reminding her that her journey wasn't over. Connor's final message. Madison flipped open the sketch pad, her hands shaking. Connor's drawings had always been his way of making sense of the world, and she clung to the hope that his final sketches might hold the key to understanding what he had endured. The first few pages were familiar, drawings of the shadow, the forest, and the spiral-carved tree. But as she turned the pages, the images grew darker, more frantic. One sketch depicted the whispering shadow standing over a figure, Connor, crumpled at the base of the tree. Golden light poured from his chest, spiraling upward into the shadow's outstretched hands. Another showed the spiral symbol fractured, its jagged lines spreading outward like cracks in glass. Beneath it, Connor had written, "It's breaking." Madison's breath caught. She turned to the final page and found a single word scrawled in bold, uneven letters. Help. Her pulse quickened as realization dawned. The shadow wasn't just feeding. It was faltering. The balance it maintained was unraveling, and the forest's survival depended on keeping it intact. A desperate plan. Madison closed the sketchpad, her resolve hardening. Connor hadn't sought the shadow for himself. He had tried to save the forest. And now, it was her turn to finish what he had started. But how? The shadow had taken something from her. She could feel the emptiness inside, a void where her most cherished memories of hope and belief had once been. What more could it want? She looked at the pendant around her neck, its spiral glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was the key, she realized. Connor had worn it in his final moments, and it had guided her here. If you're listening, she said aloud, her voice steady, I'm not leaving until we fix this. The forest answered with a low rustling, the wind picking up and swirling around her. The pendant grew warmer, its light intensifying, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent than before. Madison gripped the pendant tightly, her heart racing as the forest seemed to come alive around her. Trees swayed, their branches creaking and groaning, and the ground beneath her feet vibrated with a rhythmic hum. The whispering shadow emerged from the darkness, its golden eyes glowing brighter than ever. You seek to mend what is broken, it said, its voice echoing like a distant storm. Madison met its gaze, unflinching. I seek to finish what Connor started. What do I have to do? The shadow tilted its head, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. The balance is fragile, the spiral must hold, but it requires more than one soul to sustain. Madison's stomach dropped. You mean, it needs another offering? The shadow didn't reply, but its silence was enough. The ultimate sacrifice. Madison's mind raced. She thought of Connor, of the cost he had paid, and of the forest that had been his sanctuary. She couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain, but she also couldn't give herself over completely. There has to be another way, she said, her voice trembling. Something else I can offer. The shadow stepped closer, its golden eyes piercing through her. What remains of you is already mine, it said, but you carry another gift, one untainted by fear. Madison frowned, confusion washing over her. What are you talking about? The shadow extended a long, thin arm pointing to the pendant around her neck. The connection, the bond forged by your love for the one who came before. It is pure. It is enough. Her breath hitched as she realized what it meant. The pendant wasn't just a symbol. It was a vessel. It carried the essence of her connection to Connor, the strength of their shared memories, and the love that had endured even after his death. "If I give this to you," she said slowly, "the forest will survive?" The shadow nodded. "The balance will be restored, but you will lose the bond you carry. The memory of him will fade." Madison's heart ached at the thought. Connor had been her anchor, her light in the darkest times. Letting go of him felt impossible. But as she looked around the clearing, at the forest that had been his haven, she knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she removed the pendant and held it out. "Take it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But let his sacrifice mean something." The forest reborn. The shadow reached out, its smoky fingers curling around the pendant. A brilliant light erupted from its core, spreading outward and enveloping the entire clearing. Madison shielded her eyes as the ground trembled beneath her. The spiral-carved tree glowed with golden light, its branches reaching higher as the forest around it seemed to come alive. When the light faded, the clearing was still. The tree stood taller, its spirals glowing faintly in the moonlight. The forest was quiet again, but it was a peaceful silence, no longer weighed down by whispers. Madison fell to her knees, exhaustion washing over her. The pendant was gone, and with it, the ache in her chest had disappeared. But so had the memories, the vivid images of Connor's laughter, his voice, his presence. She felt the loss like a distant echo, a shadow of something she could no longer grasp. A new beginning. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Madison made her way back to town. The forest seemed brighter now, its shadows less menacing. She didn't look back at the spiral-carved tree or the clearing where she had made her choice. She knew the forest would endure, just as Connor had wanted. And though she couldn't remember his face, she carried a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that she had done the right thing. The whispers were gone, but the bond remained. In the forest, in the balance restored, and in the legacy of those who had come before. Part 9. A Quiet Resolution. The morning light spilled through the windows of Madison's childhood home, casting soft golden hues across the wooden floors. She sat by the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in her hands. The house felt different now. Quieter, lighter, but also lonelier. The forest outside swayed gently in the breeze, its shadows no longer looming or menacing. It was as though a great weight had been lifted, yet Madison couldn't shake the strange emptiness inside her. She knew she had made the right choice. The forest was alive again, thriving and safe. But the price she had paid echoed through her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Connor's face was a blur in her memory now. She couldn't recall his laugh, the exact shade of his hair, or the way his voice had sounded when he teased her. All that remained was the faint knowledge of his importance, a quiet, persistent ache she couldn't quite name. Reconnecting with Jack. A knock on the door startled her. Setting the coffee cup down, Madison crossed the room and opened the door to find Jack standing there, a hesitant smile on his face. "Thought I'd check in," he said, holding up a thermos. "Figured you could use some real coffee after everything." Madison smiled faintly and stepped aside to let him in. Jack sat across from her at the kitchen table, pouring 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You've been quiet," he said, studying her. "What happened out there?" Madison hesitated. How could she explain what she had seen, what she had given? The whispering shadow, the visions, the sacrifice. It felt like trying to describe a dream that had already begun to fade. "I did what Connor couldn't finish," she said finally, her voice soft. "The forest is safe now." Jack nodded, though his brow furrowed with questions he didn't voice. "And you? Are you okay?" Madison looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup. "I don't know," she admitted. "It feels like I lost something important, but I can't remember what it was." Jack reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "Whatever it was, I think Connor would have been proud of you." Madison's eyes stung, though no tears came. She nodded, grateful for the sentiment, even if she couldn't fully grasp the weight of his words. The forest's whisper. That afternoon, Madison ventured back to the edge of the forest. She didn't step inside. Something about it felt sacred now, as though it no longer needed her presence. The trees swayed gently, their branches casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground. The whispers were gone, replaced by the soft hum of nature's rhythm, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant trickle of a stream. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the forest's vitality, feeling its energy wrap around her like a comforting embrace. For the first time since Connor's death, she felt a sense of peace. The spiral pendant. As Madison turned to leave, something glinted in the sunlight, catching her eye. On the ground near the forest's edge lay a small object, half buried in the soil. She knelt and carefully unearthed it, her breath catching as she realized what it was. A pendant, identical to the one she had given to the Whispering Shadow. The spiral was intact, its edges smooth and unmarred, but the light that had once radiated from it was gone. It was just a simple piece of silver now, empty, yet still significant. Madison slipped it into her pocket, unsure of what it meant, but feeling its weight like a quiet legacy of the shadow. Over the weeks that followed, Madison slowly rebuilt her life in Willow Creek. She started writing again, pouring her thoughts into words even as the memories of her time in the forest faded like mist in the morning sun. Her stories weren't about the Whispering Shadow. She couldn't quite recall enough to write them. But they carried a sense of wonder and mystery, an undercurrent of something ancient and enduring. The forest became a part of her again, though she never ventured too far into its depths. It didn't call to her anymore, and she didn't seek it out. The balance had been restored, and both she and the forest understood that their connection, while profound, had reached its end. A new purpose. One morning, Madison found herself walking through the town square, a notebook tucked under her arm. The streets were alive with the hum of daily life, children playing, shopkeepers chatting, neighbors exchanging greetings. She stopped by the library, where she had spent so much time as a child. Inside, she found a group of teenagers huddled over a table, their heads bent as they sketched maps and notes. Curious, she approached. "What are you all working on?" One of the kids looked up, grinning. "We're mapping out the forest. It's so cool. There's this giant tree with carvings all over it. Have you ever seen it?" Madison smiled faintly. "Once or twice," she said. "Be careful out there. The forest has a way of keeping its secrets." The kids nodded eagerly, their excitement undimmed. As Madison walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The forest was safe now, thriving, and full of stories waiting to be discovered. And though she couldn't remember all the details of her own story, she knew it had played a part in shaping what the forest had become. The final whisper. That night, as Madison sat by the fireplace with her notebook, she thought she heard something. Soft, faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. She froze, her pen hovering above the page, listening intently. But the sound didn't come again. She smiled to herself, closing the notebook. "Good night, Connor," she whispered, the name slipping from her lips without conscious thought. And somewhere, deep within the forest, the spiral tree stood tall, its carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. The Whispering Shadow watched over it still, its golden eyes ever vigilant. The balance was restored.